Welcome everyone, I'm Sensei Tony. Namo frutos, namo frutos, namo frutos. Let us celebrate the liturgy of the day. Let us share the peace. May all beings awaken to that peace which is our true home. Let us take refuge I take refuge in the ground of being, within which I live and move and breathe. Let us make the accord. I take sanctuary in the heart of being, accepting all my delusions in thought, word, or deed, born of ignorance, hatred, and greed. Let us give thanks. I give thanks for all things, awakening to the interbeing of all nature. May my heart be open and my mind clear. May all be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and may all come to know that peace which is born of insight and understanding. Since it is the practice of enlightenment, that practice has no beginning. And since it is enlightenment within the practice, that realization has no end. Welcome everyone to tonight's meditation service. We had some technical difficulties, but hope you stayed with us. So I begin tonight with our readings. We have two readings tonight representing both perspectives. So the first one is by Richard Feynman, who is one of the most, I would say the most beloved and respected physicists that has ever lived, probably, quantum physicist. So this is a quote by Richard Feynman. You have no responsibility to live up to what other people think you ought to accomplish. I have no responsibility to be like they expect me to be. It's their mistake, not my feeling. And our second reading is by Lao Tzu. Care about what other people think, and you will always be their prisoner. So last week we answered a question, which is all part of my newest book here. The last section of this book, the Three Principles of Oneness, is called Ask Sensei Tony. So people will basically send in questions to me. And last week's question was, what is the purpose of life? Or what is my purpose? And so one of our members made a really interesting follow-up to that, because I touched on this last week, but really didn't go into much detail. And I talked about, path versus plan. And someone said, well, how do you find your path? And so I thought that was a good follow-up discussion. So let me talk about what that means. So I mentioned last week that your path, or as it's known in Sanskrit, marga, is meant to be very personal. So even though these practices were pioneered by Shakyamuni 3,000 years ago, it was never the intent that anyone would do exactly what he did. That each person for themselves had to discover what their path, their dharma, their way was. And that anyone who went before, which is what the word sensei means, what teacher means, just means that they could be a guide, but they could never do it for you. I remember one mentor of mine saying that I can no more give you enlightenment than I can, he was a little bit cruder than this, use the bathroom for you. And that really brings it home, that the teachers and guides can point you to the door, but you have to walk through the door yourself. So all of our paths are unique in the sense that they're ours. Now there are universal aspects to our path, and these teachings can help us with those aspects. But there are parts of it that only you can discover by living your own quest, your own life, your own journey. Now, in order to find out what your path is, I mentioned last week that for me, I think your path begins by finding what it is that makes you happy. Now, sometimes people will deride that and they'll say, well, it's not about being happy, it's about fulfillment, or it's about the struggle, or it's some other thing. But Buddhists have always been pretty happy and content, pun intended, the word happy. We've always been very content with that concept. But what does it mean for us? And I've often thought that along with one of the presentations in Buddhism is something called the Eightfold Path, right? Or it's called the Noble Eightfold Path. And I've always thought you could add one to that, and that would be happiness. Happiness. Now, some people sort of present happiness as a side effect of the practices. And I think that there is some truth in that. But I'm going to lay out 3 ways within which I think happiness can be experienced. And I would say this much. Wow, this is a tough one to say, but it's something that I know is true. Happiness is a responsibility. In other words, happiness isn't just something that you hope for, but happiness is a responsibility. What I mean by that is, I think that happiness is a virtue. I think it is something that one must cultivate and one must be committed to. So happiness being a noble path means that it's something that we just don't kind of wait for or hope for. It's something that we create. And it's something we're committed to. Because I think we have a responsibility to be happy. Now, obviously, if someone is in great suffering, then they need help. They need help with that, to overcome that suffering. But I think that people need to have a commitment to being happy. If you're in a household where someone is really not happy, it affects everyone. I mean, it really, really brings everyone down to some degree. Or if you love those people or you love that person, you have a very hard time detaching yourself from where they're at. You really believe that your happiness is tied to their happiness in some sense. And while I wouldn't advocate that, I would say that just like anything else, the environment we're in is either conducive to us practicing happiness or it's not. And so I think that it's really important for people to feel a sense of responsibility in their home. When you're at work, if there's somebody at work who's unhappy, it affects everything. So, people wandering around unhappy and thinking that that status quo is acceptable, to me is something that I don't agree with. I think we have a commitment to being happy, a responsibility to being happy. Now again, like I said, if we're suffering, certainly we're not going to be able to fake being happy, and I'm not advocating that. But if we're unhappy, then we must do something about it. We can't just reside in the land of despair. That we must be committed to our happiness, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of others. So I think of it as a responsibility. And I know that's a little different, but I truly believe that. In myself, I certainly have my times and periods where I am depressed or I am in some feeling of despair. But I recognize that, okay, there I am. That's what I'm experiencing right now. Now what am I going to do about it? And some people get so comfortable being sad or being down that becomes kind of the way they negotiate everything in their life. But it's not helpful. It is really not helpful. And I think in some way it contributes to an environment that makes it more difficult for others to be happy. So we have a commitment to it. Now, when I think of what happiness is comprised of, here are three things that I think comprises it. First of all, I would say that number one is our view. So it's like our basic view of life, our perspective. That's number one. So what is this view? Most of us have a brain that when it looks at something, it's looking for the errors. It's looking for the mistakes. And that evolutionary development in us was a way initially to help us to survive. You have a part of your brain called the reticular activating aspect that filters out everything that's good and happy and peaceful and looks for everything that is dangerous and new. And that's why, people have learned over the years that they can successfully market to others by stressing danger if you don't do what they suggest. Or it's new. It's the new thing no one's heard of. And that's what draws us in. Oh, I want to know what's new. It's dangerous? Well, I want to know what's dangerous. Especially today, right? And you see how it manipulates everyone. And it draws us away from our center, which is peaceful and clear. So our view is inherently conditioned by this mechanism to see the cracks in things. So if I look at the floor, my eye picks up the things that's wrong. Or imagine, I was thinking about the other night, I was looking at our bathroom tile, and I was thinking, well, that one tile is out of place. That one tile is not quite right. So that's what my brain goes to. It doesn't see the other 100 tiles that are all nicely in place. It sees that one that isn't. Now the thing is, if I correct that, if possible, that makes sense for a floor. But the problem is, everything has a crack in it. There is no such thing as perfection. It does not exist. It never has existed, and it never will. And that perfectionism is what is developed out of always looking for the flaw. Like when you look at yourself in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see all the wonderful, beautiful things about you? Well, maybe if you're a narcissist, but most people don't. Most people look at the flaws and go, oh, that's nice, but what about that? I do it. We all do it. Because that's the conditioning we had in our early development. Now, our parents also had. So sometimes we end up with parents who kind of do the same thing with us. They look at our flaws. They don't look at the things we're doing well, right? How many of you growing up, if you had a good report card, but you had one thing that wasn't good, that was the emphasis. And that's why kids that misbehave, that need attention, who want attention, who are craving it, always do the bad things, because they know that's going to get the attention. So this isn't some dark mystery. We know this is so. But we must decide if that view is the view that's going to serve us. And I don't think it does. So what's the view that serves us? Well, the opposite side of perfectionism, or the light side, if we say perfectionism is the shadow side, the light side is excellence. Is excellence. Where we want to manifest and be all that we can be. We want to live out of our talents. We want to live out of our personal expression. We want our lives to have some sort of meaning. And so excellence to me is achievable. Excellence gets me going, gets me working at things. Perfectionism often leads to procrastination or not doing anything, because if it can't be perfect, well, what the hell with it? Right? Have you been there? I know I have. And so part of the definition of happiness that I have, my understanding of the Dharma, is that we must begin with the view that is realistic. And that realistic view is that everything has a crack in it. There is no such thing as perfection. You will never be perfect no matter how hard you strive. And even when you get it, when you think you've got it, right? And you're holding it, right? Oh, I've got it now. And then something chips away at that. The thing we call change. And we're like, oh no. Right? And it creates more suffering. I know this very well. So the view that is noble is to realize that everything has a crack in it. And like the poet once said, Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And there is a practice in Japanese where you take a cup, or you take some, bowl or something of this nature, some ceramic, and overuse in time, guess what? It wears, it cracks. But they have this practice of where they take gold and they put gold in the cracks. Right? It's a beautiful practice. And often I see my work as a teacher and a counselor as doing that. People bring their cracks and I take my gold brush. Right? That's our view. That is our view. That life is imperfect. It has cracks in it. But that's where the light comes in. And we recognize that light by painting it with our golden brush. And then it becomes truly excellent. Truly beautiful. And people that have this perspective, this view, they get it. You get it. You've done it too. You see something that's imperfect, right? And there's something about that that makes it more special than the thing that's just completely, right? That's the view that we cultivate. That's the view that we honor. That's the view that we practice. So that's number one, the right view. Secondly, we have these practices that allow us to clarify when that other situation is occurring. And we call those the practice of mindfulness. And that is the practice of when we realize that we are obsessing about a crack, when we're obsessing about the imperfection. That's when we stop, we look and listen, and we apply the principles and practices of mindfulness. And when we do that, along with that view, that's how we practice the noble path of happiness. There's a third practice, and this is the practice of gratitude. Gratitude. Gratitude is like this, it's very punk in a way, it's very metal. It's very metal, because what it's saying is, yeah, like what were the words from The Life of Brian? Life's a piece of shit when you look at it, but always look on the right side of life. Gratitude is that. Gratitude to me is what that song means. It means to practice it intentionally, to sit around and look at the things that I'm grateful for. My one mentor, one beloved mentor, Al Bloom. Sensei Bloom used to say to me, that gratitude was the only practice, the primary practice that he had. And he told me one time that when his heart, he had a lot of problems with his heart, and he was facing this major surgery, which he could die. He started practicing his gratitude by looking at every little thing in his life. So the first thing he did was he took a deep breath, and he realized how grateful he was that he could breathe. Because if we're not breathing, we're dead. And so he could breathe. And that led him to a sense of gratitude for the trees that help create the oxygen. And that led him to a gratitude for this earth that he happens to inhabit. And that led him to a place of gratitude for this sweet spot in the Milky Way that he is located in. And he went out into the great cosmic perspective, and then he came back down, and he was so grateful for his morning cup of coffee. You know, when we do that, right? Some people do that as a way of mindfulness. Mine's Pepsi. When I smell Pepsi, I feel good. So gratitude is paying attention to all of the things like that. But we have to do it. Again, it's a responsibility. Gratitude just doesn't happen. You know, it's not like we were like walking around, oh, I'm so grateful, I'm so grateful. Most of the time we're not, because of the other stuff I mentioned earlier. So we have to intentionally practice it, even when we don't feel like it. If there's one thing that anyone gets from this practice, it should be this: stop trusting your feelings to guide you. And don't even trust your thoughts. Clarify. And practice gratitude. One of the practices that I've given people at times is I've said to them, I want you to write down 100 things you're grateful for. And believe it or not, people find that incredibly difficult. We know why that is. So this is a path of courage. We have to practice it. We have to have the commitment to it and the intention to it. And what's the payoff? We're happy. You will never meet someone who is happy, who is obsessive about all the imperfections. You will never meet someone who is happy, who is just a puppet on the string of their emotions, their feelings, and the thoughts that are diluted. And you will never meet a single soul that is happy who is not a person of gratitude. You can't have it. You can't be grateful and be sad. Okay, so that's the groundwork, right? Excuse me, that's the framework. That's our foundation. Now, our path. So in ancient India, it was understood that there are 4 different types of people. Now, this was like an early personality type that they had developed. And we have lots of them too, like Myers-Briggs, the Jungian version. But basically, these were not put out there to kind of, put us in stone and say, well, that's who I am, I can never change. But it was more just to kind of understand maybe our orientation that we had. And so there are 4 types. The first type is what is known as the devotional or more emotional type. The second is the intellectual type. The third is the action or physically oriented type. And the fourth is the contemplative or psychologically oriented type. Now, we can have a combination of these, and we probably have a little of each of these in us. But we have what we would call our primary functions. And so understanding this can really help you in finding your personal path. So for example, if you're a person of action, then you're really focused on how things work. And you want to be actively involved in that physical experience. So some people really find that they enjoy physical actions. You know, I think of a carpenter, right? Or I think of a builder, or someone maybe who athletics is their thing. They're really, really focused on that physical experience. And that's what really gives them a sense of happiness. When they're doing that, they feel really good. The intellectual type is the person that loves to learn and use their brain. They love to read and study and learn things. And they're very intellectual. They have a very rich mind. And they love to explore and expand. The emotional devotional person, that's the person who has this sort of natural gregariousness. They love and are energized by people. And they love to have that interaction with people. That's what really lifts them. That's what makes them feel alive. And then you have the contemplative, psychological people. And they're very introspective. And they like to understand how the mind works. But more than that, they want to know why it matters. And they feel best when they are living out of that type. And each of these types has, in some ways, a predominance towards how things work or why they matter. So, for example, the emotional, devotional person, for them, it's more about why things matter. It's about relationships, right? For the intellectual person, it's a lot more about how things work. For the action physical person, it's also about how things work. And for the contemplative person, it's more about why they matter. So the first thing you can do when you're trying to discover your personal path is kind of figure out what's your main orientation. Now, I would say developing the other areas that are not as primary for you will probably be a way for you to develop more wholeness in your life. So if you're more intellectual, by undertaking doing physical things, and here's a trick I've found. If your predominant function is intellectual, for example, then the best thing you can do is do something the opposite of that. That can help snap you out of wherever you're at. So like if I'm an intellectual person, if I engage in something physical, some kind of action orientation, or I do something that is emotional, devotional, that kind of thing, it kind of snaps you out of that sort of freeze that sometimes we get into. And the same thing is true in the opposite direction. You know, a person who's always about relationships and about the outer world and that dynamic, sometimes can be, by turning within and having quiet time, that helps to balance that out, helps to snap them out of an outer situation that goes wrong. Is that clear so far? All right, so knowing that type can really help us, because if we fight that, if we're in something that doesn't suit our primary function, we're probably not going to be very happy. We might be very intelligent and very skilled, so we can do a lot of things, but there's this one thing that really is, when I'm doing that, that's when I really, really feel good. And when it comes to knowing your path, there's two types of persons. Some people, they know early on. They know from the get-go what they're going to want to do, right? Like, I think of myself. When I was a wee boy, I just had this realization that I wanted to do what I'm doing. I was only 6 years old. And I knew it my whole life. Now, I tried to do some other things, but I was never really happy doing those other things. I'm a pretty smart guy. I can do a lot of things. But I was never really happy doing those other things. And none of the things that those things brought me, which honestly were financial well-being, it was never enough. It was never enough. My wife, when she was little, she was a teacher, she used to line up her stuffed animals on her bed. and conduct classes when she was just a little girl. So we were fortunate. We both knew what we wanted. Now that doesn't always make it easy. Like I said, I had an entrepreneurial father who was wonderful, but for him it was action. It was that emotional action thing, right? And here I am, this contemplative intellectual one, right? And so it was a conflict. So I had to try to do his world for a while, and I could do it. But it wasn't right for me. So we have to, even when we know what our path is, we have to discern and work at that. Now, the other type of person, they don't know what they want to do. In other words, for that first person, and this is the line that I like, that I was thinking of earlier, it takes a lot of work to do what they love. In other words, if you know what you want to do, it takes a lot of work to do what you love to do. It takes a lot of work to do that. Now, the other type of person, it's different for them. Because that first type of person, that passion leads to a sense of vocation. Vocatus. It's like they're called, right? And that passion leads to action. But that's that first kind of person. And then there's another type of person. And that person doesn't know. They don't know what it is they're going to do, right? So it takes a lot of experimentation. But through that experimentation, they will sometimes find that thing that ignites that passion. They discover and realize what their calling is. But then there's another type of person who's kind of in that same category, a third type. And they also don't know what they want to do. And for some reason, they really don't. I mean, they just don't have a drive for something, They don't discover it at some point and go, oh man, that's it. They don't. So what do? Well, here's the secret for them. They have to learn to love what they do. In other words, instead of the passion leading to action, the passion comes from action. In other words, what they do to make a living, to make income for themselves or their family, to put a roof over their heads, and so forth and so on. That might not be the thing that really, really does it for them. But they tried lots of things and nothing has really done that. So at some point, that type of person has to realize that maybe they're this third type, and that them continually trying to find that thing is a mistake. And rather what they should do is try to learn to love what they're doing. And instead of living out of a life of vocation, they live a life of avocation, where what they do at work isn't their real passion. It's the thing they do after work. Maybe it's their family. Maybe it's a hobby. We really don't know what that means anymore, because a lot of us aren't oriented that way. I don't really have any hobbies. I'm living my passion, my vocation. But I know lots of people who are very happy living out an avocation, where the thing that really gives them really good vibes and good energy is when they go bowling with their friends and they're on the bowling team, or they're on this team. I remember a corporate client of mine, he was trying to always motivate, he was in Western Pennsylvania and out in the rural area. He was always trying to motivate his workers who worked in a factory making widgets for weed whackers, okay? He was always trying to give them more money to get them to do more. And so I met with them and talked with them, the people. And I found out that most of these guys, the two things that they loved doing were bowling and hunting. That was their passions. That's what they grew up with their fathers, their mothers, and that's what their passion was. So I said to them, I said, look, you're going at this the wrong way. You're projecting onto them what motivates you. It doesn't motivate them. So stop giving them more money and start offering them more time off to do the things they want to do, or put some money and form a really good league for them so they can have a really good team and they can compete with other leagues. And if the leagues don't exist, create a league, create it. Go out there and go to your other business friends and partners and create a league for them. And guess what? That's what he did. Bill. And guess what? It worked. His workers were happier, they were more productive, and they felt a greater sense of loyalty to their company. That's what they wanted. But you have to discover what kind of person your primary orientation is. And if you really have that avocation one, that's it. That's your path. Stop trying to find the thing, the job. It ain't going to be that. And it's okay. I want to finish by saying that, is that stuff clear so far? I hope people find it helpful. I hope you're finding it helpful. So, a few more things I want to say. And these, so there's our basic entry point. Because if you get those parts, believe me, you're a long way there to that commitment to being happy. So there's two things that people tend to have in a life. There is what I call life and legacy. And life and legacy is something that ultimately, and I learned this by being at the bedside of those who were dying. The honor of being by those as they were making their transition. And guess what? It was always life and legacy. Always. Now the legacy part, I found that more among people who had lived a little bit longer, but not always. Not always. There were great exceptions to that. But what is the life part? Well, the life part is about the relationships you develop. So in this commitment to happiness, you have to develop relationships, because those relationships and caring for those relationships, that's your life, right? That's really your life. The legacy is your work. So they're both important, and you can't really, in my opinion, have one without the other. Now your type will help you kind of discover, the energy of where you put things, but I think that understanding makes it a lot easier. So when people ask me, what's your priority in things? I always tell them my life, my relationships. That's my number one priority. Because when I'm not doing well, or when I really am doing well and I want to enjoy it, I want to share that joy. And in fact, joy in some ways from the Buddhist perspective can only be experienced together. So the relationship part for me is the first thing. First thing actually is my practice. Taking care of me and making sure I'm committed and clear and connected. The second part is that relationships. And that's what's important to me. And then the next thing is my legacy. That's what's important to me. That my work, the things that I'm doing, the things that I've created, that also requires a great bit of devotion. But those are the three things. And I have found if you follow that priority, and I've worked with a lot of people over the last 30 odd years, no one has ever come to me and said, boy, that let me down. Boy, that was the wrong way to go. And I've had the pleasure of working people from this point to the point when they went here to their transition. And they never said to me, boy, I'm glad I wish I hadn't met you and devoted so much time to that priority. It's the opposite. And when I worked with people that were dying, the ones that were happy, the ones who had that priority. Like I say, legacy is important too, the work's important. Work can be a great way to help snap you out of things. I always feel like I'm cheating because when things go bad, I can always take tension away from myself and work with somebody. And that's always healing, not just for them, but for me. Always. How am I doing on time?
20 minutes.
Okay. We started about what?
It was 10 till 7.
Okay, so we're good. All right. So, 2 other things. 3 really. Complacency can kill. Don't be complacent. That's part of the commitment to being happy is don't be complacent. Complacency is something that we all fall into, and it's really what happens when we're afraid of change. We get complacent. And it's a form of procrastination. So just remember that complacency, it can kill, man. Complacency can kill the spirit. Next, expectations can be very destructive. If there's one thing that people should learn to do in this practice, besides not trusting their feelings to guide them, is stop having expectations. And that's not easy to do at first. But we all do, right? We always have these unconscious expectations. Expectations of you, expectations of me, expectations of that or this. But the reality is that mindset of always having expectations, well, guess what? You're going to be let down. More often than not, your expectations will not turn out the way you expected. Now, some people do then react to that by complacency, right? But that's just another side of that coin. So expectations, not having a lot of expectations, allows you to experience when things are going well to have a greater sense of realization, a greater awareness and gratitude, because you don't have big expectations, great expectations, because you know that sets you up for perfection. So give up your expectations. All things have negatives. So when you're thinking about your path and what you want to do, everything has something negative in it. I mean, there's always a drag to something. There's always something, right? So I have always lived as an entrepreneur, spiritual teacher, counselor, etc. And the downside of that is you don't always know about your financial liquidity. And you have to figure out a lot of things on your own, like taxes and stuff like that. So that's a challenge when you're doing it. And it's not really fun. But you got to decide which one you want. So for me, the idea that I would have to work for somebody else, that far outweighs for me in terms of what I don't want than the once in a while struggling with finances, or once in a while, struggling with my taxes and figuring out the legal things and all that stuff that I have to do because I'm self-employed. I would never trade that for the freedom that I have. But for some people, it's not that way. That's not their type. That part would be far worse for them than some of the things that are required by having a 9-to-5 situation, working for somebody else. But that's what you have to discover. But there's always going to be something negative. So you just have to figure out which negative do you like less. And finally and lastly, don't compare or compete. Don't compare or compete with anyone. Because the minute you start to do that, you're no longer, that's why I started with those quotes by Feynman and Lao Tzu. Now you're a prisoner of somebody else's idea of who you should be or what you should be doing. So commit to not comparing yourself, not competing with anyone. And I will never compare or compete, never. And when I find myself falling into it just a wee bit, I smack myself back to reality and say, no, don't do it. Because I want to be authentically me. And I know I'm unique. There's nobody else like me in this whole universe. Same's true for you. And I want to express that. And the only way to do that is to stop comparing and stop competing. Because as Feynman and Lao Tzu said, once you start doing that, then you're playing somebody else's game. You're already a prisoner of their thoughts and expectations. The Buddha is supposed to have said early on, that you should be a light unto yourself. Sometimes the word is translated as lamp or light. Other times it's translated as island. The Buddha advocated you be an island unto yourself. You be a light unto yourself. Don't try to get it from somewhere else or somebody else. He said, live like a rhino's horn. Sounds odd, right? But what he meant by that was, there's one. And live out of that perspective. Be a light to yourselves. That is the ultimate path. The moment we receive true and trusting, solid and clear like a diamond, infinite light and life embrace and protect us, liberating us completely. Let us take together the four immeasurable vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Delusions are endless, I vow to end them. The ways of compassion and wisdom are boundless, I vow to embody them. The ways unattainable, I vow to attain them. Let us share the precepts for the community of the vow. I allow my true self to manifest in all aspects of life. I take complete responsibility for my own life and all of my actions. I affirm my personal being and acknowledge it as a path to awakening and freedom. I embrace all aspects of my personal being, including my shadow, so that they may be transformed. I affirm an attitude of openness to my true self, even in the midst of suffering. We will now make our offering, and then we will chant, and our mantra tonight will be the Nembutsu, and then we'll spend some time quiet in the stillness. So let us begin. Oh. knowing that we never truly practice alone or just for ourselves. Let us offer the merit of our life in the Bodhisattva. We dedicate this practice to the welfare of all beings throughout space and time. May it always be so. Nam. 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 That concludes tonight's meditation service. If you are trying to discover your own personal path, you can reach us through our website at senseitony.com, and we'll be happy to help in any way